I am Frank Schumpert, your host, and you are listening to the Empires of History podcast, the Ottoman series, episode 5, Murad I, Janissaries, and Chernomen. If you are new to empires, I thank you for stopping by. If you are a returning listener, many thanks as well. I thank you also for subscribing on Apple Podcast and visiting the show's website at all one word, empiresofhistorypodcast.blueberry.net. That last part is spelled blueberry.net, BLUBRRY.net, where you can comment and subscribe. I am happy also to announce the show is now available on Stitcher and Spotify. You can find a link to both on the show's website. As usual, if you feel I can improve the show, please drop me a line at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Are you interested in supporting the show? How about leaving me a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify? It would greatly help out, and I'd certainly appreciate it. You can also email me with a real estate referral, of which I'd be eternally grateful. Or you can support Empires through Patreon, which you can find a link on my website. I hope you enjoy the show. First, before we begin, a bit on the name. When researching this episode, I found a different spelling of Sultan Murad. Some have it as a T at the end of his name instead of a D, which would make his name sound quite French, as in Moreau. Looking deeper into this, I could find no source to verify his name into English, surprising as that may sound. For every source bearing Moreau with an O at the end, there was another as Murad or Murad with a D at the end. Thus, for simplicity's sake, I am going to refer to our grateful Sultan as Murad. Murad became the next Sultan after the death of Orhan in 1362 at the age of 40. Before being girded with the sword of Osman in the city of his father's burial, Bursa, Murad found himself the beneficiary of the grand strategic vision of Orhan. An experienced and professional military force, strategically important holdings in Europe, weakened neighbors, and a full treasury. Across the Bosporus, the Ottoman army was ready to invade the rest of Thrace and push deep into Macedonia. Already at Orhan's death, the Achaeans were raiding all the way to the important Byzantine city of Adrianople, and the place was all but abandoned, ready to fall into Ottoman hands. On the Anatolian side of the empire, Turkic beys had been causing trouble for the Ottomans for at least the last decade of Orhan's rule. Concerned and not a bit jealous, local beys sought to disrupt the movement of warriors and trade into Orhan's realm. One in particular, the Karamanids, were centered in south-central Anatolia around their capital city of Konya. Established about the same time as the Ottomans, the Karamanids became one of the more powerful contenders in the region, and the expanding Ottomans would soon have to deal with them if they were to push into central Anatolia. Murad I would soon be pitting the Ottoman military against them as he played a strategic balancing act between the European and Anatolian holdings. The sources dealing with Murad I seem to give him a cursory glance, which is strange considering the length of his reign, some 27 years, and the fundamental changes and reforms he implemented. Most sources cover him as that sultan who took Adrianople and then was assassinated by Serbian lords. But I promise we will dig much deeper than that. Murad had grown up largely under the shadow of his much older brother Suleiman Pasha, who, as we recall in other episodes, was the hero of Gallipoli and provided his father with captives, tribute, and fortresses. Murad, on the other hand, though taken care of, was regulated largely to commanding smaller contingents of Ottoman forces on raids in Anatolia. Murad married his first wife, of 4 that we know of, in 1359, Gulselek, who produced Murad's eventual successor, Bayezid I. Between his 4 wives, Murad would sire 5 sons and 2 daughters. An interesting insight into the Ottoman world at this time is that even with Murad's high status in his society as a son of Orhan, it was never seen important enough to learn to read or write. Indeed, Murad signed by using an ornate design of his thumbprint pressed into documents. This symbol, or turga, would later be used as a highly stylized version of the imperial seal by future sultans. It's important to bring this next aspect of Murad's I reign up now rather than later, because from this point forward, they will begin to play an increasingly large role, the Janissaries. No reading of the Ottoman Empire is ever complete without at least a short mention of their name and battles and the so hated by Christian West system that created them, the Dervishreim, quite literally meaning boy tribute system. Most historians attribute the creation of the Janissary Corp to Murad I. However, others, such as the late Godfrey Goodwin in his awesome book, The Janissaries, believe the precedent for a dedicated fighting force loyal to the Sultan and drawn from an exclusive recruitment process predated Murad all the way to the time of Orhan. The Janissaries would transform in the coming decades into the Ottoman Empire's full-time, salaried, and professional standing army and serve as the elite reserve on the battlefield. The Janissaries would become also the scourge of Europe and were hated and feared for two chief reasons I will explain. First, the Janissaries, in the beginning under Murad, then later sharpened into a truly impressive fighting force under successive sultans, were good. They were at the forefront of military technology and battlefield tactics. An excellent example was their use of muskets. Back in a time when gunpowder weapons were incredibly expensive and rare, the companies of Janissaries were often armed with them and trained in focus fire. This would prove a terrible surprise to medieval armies not prepared to face a volley of musket shot. Not only schooled in the arts of war, but the Janissaries had mastered the haphazard practice of supplying armies in the field as well. Many times Ottoman armies were victorious on the battlefield not because of their prowess, but because the men were sufficiently fed, horses watered, and they didn't have the need to forage for supplies or live off the land while on the march, unlike their Christian counterparts. The second reason the Christian West hated and feared the Janissaries were because of the manner in which the men were recruited. One of the primary motivating factors of Sultan Murad and his successors in establishing the Janissary Corps was the necessity of having full-time bodyguards not supplied by local, prominent, and dubious Turkish families. The Ottomans had watched the Byzantine emperors and seen what happened when the personal security of the emperor was left to hired mercenaries. Said men often rebelled against their lord, hired to protect, or demanded extravagant sums of cash to placate them and keep them loyal. Thus, to avoid having to hire mercenaries, and distrustful of fellow Turks, the Ottoman imperial family turned to taking a fifth of captured Christians from the battlefield and inducing them to serve as slaves of the Sultan as his bodyguards. This solution solved problems. One, where did the Sultan get the men? Who were all these Christian knights with skills we captured on the battlefield? What are they going to do now that they've been captured and no one will ransom them? By taking captive Christians and turning them into Janissaries, the sultans were able to employ their considerable skills to their cause. Plus, the Christian converts to Islam and induction into the Janissary Corps meant they had absolutely no local loyalties and were totally dependent upon the will of the Sultan. When the battlefield captives' ranks began to thin and the need for the Janissary Corps to expand rapidly arose for a variety of reasons, the Ottomans would later turn to a system of very literally, as I said before, boy tribute. Administered by a locally capable Ottoman civil servant, the Dervishreim system was established over a series of sultans in the coming years. The end result is that it worked like this. Every 7 years, a representative would travel to villages and have assembled before him the local priests and elders. Attending them were boys between the ages of 12 to 20. Cities and large towns were exempt because the Ottomans believed that city boys were inferior to the stout country folk. Boys from single-child homes were exempted also, as were the small in stature, weak, sickly, or those deemed sub-intelligent. The boys were carefully examined for physical defects, and their level of intelligence assessed. The Ottomans wanted physically strong and impressive men who possessed fierce intellect. The boys were then marched off to at first Adrianople, now renamed at this point as Edirne, then later to Constantinople, after the city's fall into the Ottoman hands. Once arriving, they converted to Islam. The boys then were paired with a Turkish family in Anatolia to learn to speak Turkish, learn their customs. After a few years of this, they were enrolled in various war colleges and either assigned to a Janissary company upon graduation, or the brightest were sent to staff the vast civil administration of the empire. We will have much, and indeed I mean much more to say about the dervish rhyme system and its larger implications for the sultans and Ottoman society as a whole in future episodes, believe me. Suffice it to say now that the forced recruitment of Christian boys and their subsequent conversion to Islam, and then the turning of the boys into vicious Janissaries, became a prominent feature of anti-Ottoman propaganda produced by Western Europe. In particular, the Germans helped to give rise to the notion of the vowed Turk persona of the Ottomans that was to last up until the empire was dissolved in the 20th century. Though the Janissary Corps would grow to some many tens of thousands, they started under Murad as Christian captives, most probably knights enrolled as the Sultan's bodyguard, and numbered between 1,000 to 2,000 throughout his life. As mentioned earlier in the episode, upon Murad's ascension to the Sultanate, Ottoman armies in Thrace and Macedonia were charged up for full, on-scale invasion of the remaining Byzantine territories, and to challenge Serbia and Hungary. Not wanting to wait for their sovereign, who was in Bursa sealing the deal after Orhan's death, local Ottoman garrisons and the irregular cavalry raiders of the Akis streamed into Upper Thrace, and sometime in either 1363 or 1365, as it happens, this was a time when the historians found it hard to pin down exact dates. The city of Adrianople fell to the Ottomans. The fall of Adrianople, now called, as I mentioned before, Edirne, caused a domino effect in Ottoman history and larger strategy. For one, the Ottoman capital was moved from Bursa to Adrianople, where it also served as the supreme military headquarters and waypoint for future Balkan invasions as well. The city seemed to cause the entire axis of the empire to become centered on Constantinople, being a mere 100 miles inland from the city, meaning that a full onslaught was only a matter of time. Though the Byzantines offered no resistance to Adrianople's fall, the city's capture did not go unnoticed in the neighborhood. Serbia and Bulgaria realized the threat decades earlier, but what was once an abstract, faraway alien threat was now on their doorstep. Serbian leaders had picked up the pattern of Ottoman infiltration and spies and raids, which, yes, was happening to their territory as the edges of the Ottoman Empire butted up against their borders. A force of Serbians and a contingent of Hungarians resolved to attempt to do something about it. Organized by Pope Urban V in 1371, while Sultan Murad was away in Anatolia fighting Turkish beys and rebellious children, which we will cover in greater detail later, 70,000 Serbians, Bulgarians, and a handful of Hungarians crossed the Martiza River just north of Adrianople. What had amounted to a crusader army, the leaders of this invader force, two Serbian brothers named Vukašin and Ukašin, resolved to pounce on Adrianople, seize the city, and swing south and hopefully grab more Ottoman fortresses, and at the very least deal a strategic blow that would hopefully, prayerfully, slow the Ottoman advance. Although having a force of some 70,000 fighters, the attacking army could have been much larger, easily twice that size, if the Christian countries could have cooperated better, a blight they would never shake in their struggles. The brothers Vukashin and Ukashin had appealed for military aid from Macedonia, parts of Bulgaria, and further north to Hungary proper. The kings and rulers, however, refused all appeals to mount a united military counterforce against the Ottomans. The only help the brothers managed to get were the local lords powerful enough to defy their king or ruler and accompany them of their own free will, hence the slightly mixed force. The brutal truth was that the Balkans, as ever by the geography, was ethnically divided against itself. Orthodox versus Catholic, versus Magyars, versus Greek, versus Hungarian, versus Wallachian, the list of mutual grievances and atrocities not distant enough to fade into memory, and simply pure fire hatred was too great to overcome. With Murad away, the European holdings under the Ottomans, called Rumelia, was left to a very capable civil administrator and military commander, Lalu Pasha. In August of 1371, the Serbian brothers crossed the Martiza River uncontested and set up camp in Ottoman territory. We don't know exactly when Lalu was alerted to the presence of this force, but what we do know is that he didn't have a force to match the invaders. Marshalling local militia and Akazi units and the household troops under his command, Lalu rushed from Adrianople to reconnoiter the force in person. What he found when he came to the Serbian camp just across from the Martiza River, he saw that the Christian camp was in poor order, and the knights and lancers and footmen were getting drunk off wine as the sun was setting. It's unknown how many men Lalu had under his command, but by some accounts it barely numbered 3,000 irregulars. Some sources I found when researching put the men he had under his control as low as 800 men. Lalu, however, realizing he didn't have a chance in a pitched battle against the Christians, simply stood put and hoped the Christians got even more inebriated. This they obliged, and sometime around midnight a lightning attack was launched, where the Ottomans struck the very center of the Christian camp. Striking the middle of the camp in the dead of night, they killed scores of men and scattered the others into the river. The Christian knights are said to have fled in a wild, drunken panic into the rivers, where the majority of them drowned. They hadn't learned to grab a hold of their horses' tails as they forged a river like the Ottomans had. The bodies of the Serbian brothers who led this attack were never recovered, and it's believed they perished in the cold waters. Remembered by the Turks as the Battle of Chernomen and by the Serbs as Martiza, this Ottoman victory would come at a fortunate time. For although the Balkan countries were never fully able to unite, they did, after a series of pauses and shorts and stops, launch independent powerful attacks that forced the Ottomans to dedicate substantial military power to repulse them. In next episode, we will explore Murad's campaigns and actions in Anatolia, and follow him back into the Balkans to expand Ottoman power further. Thank you for listening to the show. If you feel the show helped pass the time, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. Many thanks.